Let's start by clarifying what we mean when we say civil rights. When we talk about civil rights, we are talking about the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. Therefore, in a general sense, the civil rights era refers to the years between 1953 and 1968, when African Americans sought to end the legalized racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, and racial segregation in the United States. However, civil rights movements also existed outside of the United States. For example, there were civil rights movements in Europe and Africa. The movement has its origins in the Reconstruction era during the late 19th century after the American Civil War. However, it wasn't until the mid-1960s that the movement achieved its largest legislative gains after years of direct action and grassroots protests. Major non-violent resistance campaigns eventually secured new protections in federal law for the human rights of all Americans. When the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment implemented, slavery, other than as means of punishment for a crime, was officially abolished in the United States, but it didn't end discrimination against black people. Black people continued to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By around the mid-20th century, Black Americans had endured centuries of inequality, prejudice, discrimination, and violence, and in short, enough was enough. They, along with many white allies, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. Now, as we all know, to implement real change, it must start with policy changes and changes to any legislation that promotes inequality. And how do we go about doing that? By voting. Now, even though all Americans had gained the right to vote constitutionally, many southern states made it difficult for black citizens. They often required prospective voters of colour to take literacy tests that were confusing, misleading, and nearly impossible to pass. So it was almost like a cycle where black people were denied education, leading to high rates of illiteracy. Black people needed to vote for someone to represent them in government, but they couldn't vote because they couldn't pass the literacy test. So the cycle goes on and on. Lack of education, can't pass the literacy tests, can't vote for change. Then came along the Eisenhower administration in 1953, who, amongst other things, wanted to show a commitment to the civil rights movement and minimize racial tensions in the South. And they did make several strides to assist the movement. Fact: all black people in the USA were not granted the right to vote until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote, as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution. The case of Brown versus the Board of Education was a landmark judgment in which the US Supreme Court ruled that US state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality. The Brown case was a huge step in the civil rights movement at the time. The case originated in 1951 when the public school district of Topeka, Kansas refused to enroll the daughter of a local black resident named Oliver Brown at the closest school to their home. Instead, she was required to ride a bus to a segregated black elementary school much further away. Obviously, to any rational mind, this seems absurd. Why should your child have to travel miles away when there is a perfectly good school locally? So the Browns and 12 other local black families in similar situations filed a class action lawsuit in a US federal court against the Topeka Board of Education, alleging that its segregation policy was unconstitutional. The US District Court for the District of Kansas gave a verdict against the Browns. The court relied on the precedent of the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Do you remember that from earlier when we looked at white supremacy? And if you remember, the court in the Plessy case had ruled that racial segregation was not in itself a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause if the facilities in question are otherwise equal. Remember, separate but equal. Anyway, the Browns weren't happy with the decision and appealed to the Supreme Court, and on the 17th of May 1954, the court's unanimous decision stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and therefore violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. This then meant that for the first time, schools could legally integrate. Which brings us to the Little Rock Nine. In 1957, 3 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, a previously segregated school, asked for volunteers from all black high schools to attend. Then, on the 3rd of September 1957, 9 African American students, known as the Little Rock Nine, arrived at Central High School to begin classes, but were instead met by a screaming, threatening mob and the Arkansas National Guard. Yes, the army had been deployed on the orders of the governor. All this because 9 African American children wanted to get an education and wanted to get that education at a school with both black and white students. It goes without saying that their first day was unsuccessful. They didn't even make it into the building, but they tried again a couple of weeks later and they made it inside. However, later that day they had to be removed for their own safety when violence ensued. Again, all of this is because 9 African American children wanted to get an education and they wanted to get that education at a school with both black and white students. At this point, President Eisenhower intervened and ordered federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to and from classes at Central High School. Still, the students faced continual harassment and prejudice. So, simply put, the army, or rather soldiers, had to escort these 9 African American children to and from their classes, and that didn't even deter the harassers. The Little Rock Nine brought much needed attention to the issue of desegregation and fueled protests on both sides of the issue. All of the Little Rock Nine went on to study at university, with several of them going on to get PhDs. Some of them even enlisted in the army and fought for the US in the Vietnam War. Each of them grew up to be successful in their own chosen careers, something that may not have happened if they didn't fight for their education the way they did. Here are just a few images. On the left, you can see scenes from one of the girls walking into the school with the mob of white people screaming at her. Top right, you can see the Little Rock Nine walking from class, and the bottom right, you can see the Little Rock Nine as just normal, happy teenagers. Many of you have probably heard of Emmett Till, but for those of you who haven't, I'm going to speak a bit about Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old African-American boy who in 1955 was lynched in Mississippi after being accused of offending a white woman in a shop. Emmett's killing was so brutal, and the fact that his killers were acquitted drew attention to the centuries-long history of violent persecution of African Americans in the United States. In death, Emmett posthumously became an icon of the civil rights movement. So, what exactly happened to Emmett? Well, Emmett was born in Chicago, Illinois, which is geographically in the north of the United States. In August 1955, Emmett was on his summer break from school, and he went with his cousin to family in Mississippi, which is geographically in the south of the United States. Now, if you've been paying attention, you would remember that historically there was a lot of racial tension in the South, and in 1955, Jim Crow was still very much the norm. However, Emmett was born and raised in the North, where his upbringing would have been quite different from the Jim Crow South. So he was not used to how society operated down in the South. So one day, 14-year-old Emmett went with his cousins to town where they met some friends. Emmett had told these friends that he had a white girlfriend back home in Chicago, and one of the friends bet that he wouldn't talk to the white shopkeeper of the shop across the street from where they were gathered. Emmett went into the shop and he bought some gum, and then he thanked the white lady. Now, here accounts vary as to if he whistled at her or not when he left the shop, but either way, they had an interaction that she was offended by, either by speaking to the lady or by whistling at her. He had offended her. This lady was named Carolyn Bryant, and she was 21 years old, so she was 7 years older than Emmett. And she was married to a man named Roy Bryant, who was the owner of the grocery store where she had been working. So let's just take a second to unpack that. Emmett's interaction with Carolyn Bryant had violated the code of conduct for African Americans in Jim Crow South. African American males were not meant to interact with white women in the Jim Crow South. So, had Emmett been aware of the severity of his actions? Probably not. He would have likely known that there were these societal norms, but where he was raised, it was so different that he probably didn't think the repercussions would be so severe. Um, After all, he was in the same country. It's not like he was in a completely different country. Okay, so several nights after the incident in the store, Carol Ann Bryant's husband Roy and his half brother J.W. Millam, they turned up at Emmett's great uncle's house where Emmett was staying. And they turned up in the middle of the night and they were armed with guns. And they came to the house and they dragged Emmett from his bed. Bryant and Millam put Emmett in their truck and they drove away with him. And that was the last time that Emmett was seen alive. The men beat Emmett and they inflicted violent and serious injury on him before shooting him in the head and throwing his body in the Tallahatchie River. 3 days later, Emmett's body was discovered, and they retrieved it from the river. Initially, the body was so disfigured and had been beaten so badly that Emmett was unrecognizable. But he always wore a particular ring, and it was that ring that allowed them to identify him. His mum, Mamie Till Bradley, she had Emmett's body returned to Chicago for a public funeral, and she made sure that it was an open casket because she wanted to show the world what had happened to her child. The press, they were there, and they took pictures of Emmett's bloated, disfigured head, and these pictures, how stuff today goes viral, these pictures shook the world. He was 14 years old and he was murdered for talking and possibly whistling at a white woman. There was a trial and an all-white jury found Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam not guilty, despite all the evidence pointing to their guilt. Emmett's great uncle, Mose Wright, testified against the men in court, which was, at the time, it was something very dangerous for him to do because he would have faced repercussions. After the trial, Bryant and Millam, they admitted to a journalist that they had killed Emmett, and following the social backlash, they both relocated to Texas. They moved away. And then in 2017, I think it emerged in an interview that Carol Ann Bryant did in 2008. She admitted that she had lied in her testimony and falsified facts. She had said that she had done this in the event that if her husband had been convicted, then they would have used her falsified testimony in the appeal. But then she went on to say that nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him. And that's probably the only thing that we can all agree with her on. Here is a quote from the book Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans. The quote says, "The open coffin funeral held by Mamie Till Bradley exposed the world to more than her son Emmett Till's bloated, mutilated body. Her decision focused attention not only on US racism and the barbarism of lynching, but also on the limitations and vulnerabilities of American democracy." Okay, I debated with myself on whether I should or should not add the photo of Emmett Till's body from the funeral. It is such a sickening and horrific event, and this is possibly the only time I will ever agree with Carol Ann Bryant, but nothing he could have done justifies what was done to him. And the picture in the coffin is not the same Emmett that went down to spend the summer holiday with his family in Mississippi. It's just not. Ultimately, though, I decided if you haven't seen it, people should see it. For the same reasons his mother wanted an open casket, people should see the images. It should make them feel something. This is a boy in this picture. This is a 14-year-old African American boy who was murdered for interacting with a white woman in the Jim Crow South. This is real, like it really happened. It's part of the Black Lives Matter story, and therefore I have decided to include it. I'm not forcing anyone to look at it, so if you do not want to see it, you don't have to. So you will want to skip the following slide. Um, but yeah, the next slide will be the infamous picture, I guess, from Emmett Till's funeral. This photo of Emmett Till's body sparked a change and a growth in the momentum of the civil rights movement in America. The Montgomery bus boycotts were civil rights protests in which African Americans refused to ride city buses in Montgomery, Alabama, to protest their policy regarding segregated seating. The boycott took place from the 5th of December 1955 to the 20th of December 1956, and is often credited as being the first large-scale demonstration against segregation in the United States. 4 days before the boycotts began, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks was arrested and fined for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. And you can see just there on the right is a photo from her arrest. The US Supreme Court ultimately ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system. One of the leaders of the boycott was a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., and as most of us know, he emerged as a prominent leader of the American civil rights movement. On the 1st of February 1960, 4 young black men who were college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, went into Woolworth's lunch counter, a local diner. When they were denied service due to the colour of their skin, they refused to leave the diner. Over the next several days, hundreds of people joined their cause in what became known as the Greensboro sittings. The Greensboro Four, as they became known, were spurred into action by the brutal murder of Emmett Till just 5 years earlier, and their peaceful protest was supported by the Congress for Racial Equality, one of the leading activist organizations during the early years of the civil rights era. Some of the protesters were arrested and charged with trespassing, and soon after, a boycott was launched boycotting all segregated lunch counters. The owners of the Woolworths lunch counter caved, and the original 4 students were finally served at the diner where they had first stood their ground. The efforts of the Greensboro Four and their allies led to peaceful sittings and demonstrations in dozens of cities and helped launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to encourage all students to get involved in the civil rights movement. A young college graduate named Stokely Carmichael joined the SNCC during the Freedom Summer of 1964 to register black voters in Mississippi, and in 1966 Stokely Carmichael became the chair of the SNCC, giving his famous speech in which he originated the phrase "Black Power," a phrase which became synonymous with the civil rights era. On the 4th of May 1961, 13 Freedom Riders mounted a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C., embarking on a bus tour of the American South to protest segregated bus terminals. As we know, Jim Crow was still the norm down there, and they were testing the 1960 decision by the Supreme Court in the case of Boynton versus Virginia that declared the segregation of interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional. Basically, they just wanted to see if anything had changed since the decision. The 13 Freedom Riders faced violence from both police officers and white protesters, which drew international attention to their freedom rides. A couple weeks after the 13 had set out from Washington, D.C., their bus reached Anniston, Alabama. When the bus pulled in, a mob of white people got on the bus and threw a bomb into it. The Freedom Riders managed to escape the burning bus, but were badly beaten by the mob. The attack was attributed to the KKK. Following the incident in Anniston, the group couldn't find a bus driver that would take them any further. Here we just have a few photos. So on the top and bottom left, you can see the effects of the bomb and the bus engulfed in flames. And on the right, you can see a newspaper report following the incident in Anniston. Following the incident in Anniston, US Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy negotiated with Alabama Governor John Patterson to find a suitable driver so the integrated group of Freedom Riders could go on. and so they resumed their journey under police escort on the 20th of May. When the bus reached Birmingham, Alabama, about 65 miles from Anniston, again an angry mob waited and set fire to the bus. The Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner at the time stated that although he knew the Freedom Riders would be arriving and that violence awaited them, he had not posted any police at the station because it was Mother's Day. Dr. King reached out in support of the Freedom Riders and contacted Attorney General Kennedy, who responded by sending federal marshals to Birmingham. The Freedom Riders continued to Montgomery, Alabama, the same place as the bus boycott a few years earlier. The officials that had been escorting the group left them just outside Montgomery, and once again they fell victim to a waiting mob of white men who attacked the riders with baseball bats and clubs as they disembarked the bus. Attorney General Kennedy sent 600 federal marshals to the city to stop the violence. The following night, after the Freedom Riders arrived in Montgomery, Dr. King led a service at the First Baptist Church in Montgomery. The service was attended by more than 1,000 supporters of the Freedom Riders. A riot broke out outside the church, leading Dr. King to ask Robert Kennedy for protection. Robert Kennedy summoned the federal marshals, who used tear gas to disperse the mob of white rioters. Patterson declared martial law in the city and dispatched the National Guard to restore order. On the 24th of May 1961, the group reached Jackson, Mississippi. This time, though, they were greeted with hundreds of supporters waiting for them. However, when they attempted to use the whites-only facilities, they were arrested for trespassing and taken to a maximum security penitentiary. Remember, the reason they had set out on the Freedom Ride in the first place was to see if anything had changed since the decision in the Boynton case that declared the segregation of interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional. During their court appearances in Mississippi, the judge actually turned and looked at the wall rather than listen to the Freedom Riders' defense. This had also been the case when sit-in participants were arrested for protesting segregated lunch counters in Tennessee. He then proceeded to sentence the riders to 30 days in jail. However, attorneys from the civil rights organisation known as the NAACP appealed the convictions all the way to the US Supreme Court, which reversed them. The violence and arrests associated with the Freedom Rides continued to garner national and international attention, which only drew hundreds of new Freedom Riders to join the cause. Freedom Rides continued over the following months, and by October 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate transit terminals. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is arguably one of the most iconic moments of the civil rights movement. It took place on the 28th of August 1963, when more than 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The march aimed to draw attention to the continued inequality and challenges faced by African Americans a century after emancipation, challenges and inequalities they still face today. One of the reasons the March on Washington is so famous is that it was also the event at which Martin Luther King Jr. made his now iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, a speech which quickly became a slogan for equality and freedom.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when it happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speak speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
An important step in achieving change comes from legislation, so the laws that govern society. And on the 2nd of July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act was a law that guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests, and it allowed federal authorities to ensure public facilities were integrated. Martin Luther King and other prominent figures in the civil rights movement were present for the signing. It's also worth noting that the legislation was actually started by President John F. Kennedy prior to his assassination. I'll come back to this in a moment, but for now, let's move on. On the 7th of March 1965, 600 peaceful demonstrators gathered in Alabama to participate in a march from Selma to Montgomery. This was to protest the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a black civil rights activist who had been killed by a white police officer. The march aimed to encourage legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment, however it took a violent turn when state and local police blocked the route. The officers had been sent by the then Alabama governor, George C. Wallace, and he had been a vocal opponent of desegregation. The protesters refused to stand down and slowly moved forward, but they were met by the brutal force of armed officers. Protesters were viciously beaten and tear-gassed by police, and dozens of protesters had to be hospitalized. The entire incident was televised and became known as Bloody Sunday. Some activists wanted to retaliate with violence, but Dr. King, best known for his peaceful protest stance, pushed the non-violent protests and eventually gained federal protection for another march. Actually, in 2014, there was a film called Selma, which was released, and that film is a historical drama about the Selma to Montgomery marches, and the film went on to win several awards. It's definitely worth a watch. So far, we've learned that many white people opposed the notion of integration and were unwilling to see black people as equals. We've also learned that publicly speaking out on inequality and actively working towards change often meant consequences of physical harm. We literally just learned a couple slides ago that freedom riders were beaten and their buses bombed and set on fire by white people who were against integration. So in short, extreme measures were often used to silence people and halt any progress towards a more equal society. Malcolm X was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement during the 60s and was often accused of preaching violence and racism, as he was an advocate of black supremacy, black empowerment, and the separation of black and white people, believing white people were the root cause of the continued oppression of black people around the world. Unlike Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was not an advocate for peaceful protest, and for most of his life he favoured a more militant approach. On the 21st of February 1965, the former Nation of Islam leader and the founder of the Organization of Afro-American Unity was assassinated at a rally in New York City. He was 39 years old with a wife and 6 children. On April the 4th, 1968, 3 years after the assassination of Malcolm X, civil rights leader and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of a hotel room in Tennessee. His killing led to emotionally charged looting and riots, putting even more pressure on the Johnson administration to push through additional civil rights laws. You might recall a few slides ago I mentioned that President Kennedy started drafting up the Civil Rights Act before he was assassinated in 1963. There have been 45 US presidents, 4 of which have been assassinated while in office. 2 of those 4 assassinations, namely Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, happened to be 2 presidents during what are arguably 2 of the most significant eras for the civil rights of African Americans. Abraham Lincoln worked to abolish slavery and offer African Americans the same rights and freedoms as any other US citizen. JFK worked towards instituting legislation that would end segregation and guarantee equal employment for all, and limit the use of voter literacy tests. In fact, just recently, in June 2020, a plot to assassinate civil rights activist Shaun King was exposed. Shaun King is a man who has been very vocal in exposing systemic racism in the United States and is very active within the Black Lives Matter movement. I should also mention this assassination attempt was being plotted by a group of former law enforcement officials. Mere days after Martin Luther King's assassination, the Fair Housing Act came into effect. The aim of the law was to prevent housing discrimination based on race, sex, national origin, and religion. It was also the last legislation enacted during the civil rights era. In the United States, the civil rights movement was an empowering yet dangerous time for Black Americans. The efforts of the civil rights activists and the countless protesters of all races managed to bring about legislative changes that ended segregation, black voter suppression, and discriminatory employment and housing practices. Well, at least on paper. That is to say, some of these things continued and continue to happen to this day. Is it as overt as segregation? No. Does the discrimination continue? Absolutely. So by now you're probably thinking the civil rights movement was only an American thing, and let me assure you it was not. Black people all around the world were mobilizing during this period and trying to elicit change in any which way they could, and for sure Great Britain was not exempt from racist practices. In 1963, in Bristol, a 19-year-old Jamaican boy by the name of Guy Bailey went for a job interview at the Bristol Omnibus Company, which at the time was Bristol's bus service. The interview had been arranged by a local youth worker called Paul Stevenson, who, before sending Guy, had assured that there were jobs available and that Guy had the qualifications to do the job. When Guy turned up to his interview, the receptionist told the manager that his 2 o'clock appointment was here, but he was black. The manager's response to the secretary was, "Tell him we have no vacancies, all vacancies are filled." Now, it didn't come as a surprise to Bristol's black community that Guy was turned down. At the time, Bristol's black community was around 3,000, the majority of which had settled in the UK from the Caribbean shortly after the Second World War. The Windrush generation. And for them, racism in the bus service had been a long-held suspicion. Many of them had interviewed with the Bristol Omnibus Company only to be turned down, and unsurprisingly, everyone who worked at the bus company was white. The bus service's general manager at the time was quoted as saying, "You won't get a white man to admit it, but which of them will join a service where they may find themselves working under a coloured foreman?" So racism within the service was known, and the reason they didn't hire black people was that the common view held was not that they didn't want to work with black people, it was more that they didn't want to work for a black person if they were to be put in charge. So, white supremacy. I mean, it's not totally surprising given Bristol's problematic history that dates back to colonialism and its role in the slave trade. Anyway, the black community in Bristol echoed the Montgomery boycotts in America, with every single one of the city's West Indian residents boycotting the bus service. University students came out and marched in support of the boycott. Meanwhile, everyone boycotting the bus service found alternative transportation by either walking or cycling to get around the city. The day before Martin Luther King Jr. told an audience of 250,000 that he had a dream at the March on Washington, across the Atlantic in Bristol, there was a meeting of 500 bus employees, and it was agreed at that meeting to discontinue the Bristol Omnibus Company's unofficial colour bar, which led to the general manager of the company committing to ending it for good.